The United States had become a 20th century nation, but rapid change brought cascading social and political problems to a country that the federal government was simply unwilling to tackle. Now, economic depression pushed millions of Americans into poverty, and farmers responded by organizing a political movement called populism. And workers of the era organized large and violent strikes. Not since the Civil War had American politics been so impassioned and the government done so little to respond to it. The American government in this era was ill-equipped to deal with the social problems the country had. Government was evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, and divided government, that is, with one party in charge of the presidency, another party in charge of Congress. This prevented any one party from changing the country in any dramatic way for quite some time. Voter turnout in this era was astounding. 78% of eligible voters, and that is white men, they voted. Today, roughly half of people vote in our biggest elections. And people remain fiercely loyal to their parties for personal, economic, and religious reasons after the Civil War. So even though the Civil War was over 20 years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years earlier than this era we're talking about, people are still fiercely political. In most respects, the United States in the late 19th century was a society without a modern national government. Presidents were symbolically important, but unable to do much except grant political favors. Even a small change, civil service reform, that is, making federal jobs merit-based instead of just payback for political support. Making that small change took the combined efforts of Presidents Hayes, Garfield, after Garfield got assassinated, his successor, Chester A. Arthur. These three presidents, and then the next president, Grover Cleveland, they embodied an era in which few Americans believed the federal government could, or even should, accomplish very much. Benjamin Harrison, the next president, found himself in office when public opinion was beginning to turn and force the government to confront some of the pressing social and economic issues of the day, most notably the power of big business and monopolies, or what we'll call trusts. The people of the United States began to clamor for national laws that would prevent corporate monopolies from moving their headquarters to states that simply did not outlaw trusts. If the nation was to prevent business monopolies from disincentivizing competition and artificially raising prices on ordinary people, it would have to be a federal law that did so. So individual states try to take action, try to outlaw big monopolies from operating within a state, but then that business can just move into a different state. And some states didn't mind and liked the business. States like New Jersey tried to attract monopolies. It's good for a local business. Although it took time, federal antitrust laws became the law of the land, and Congress soon took up other issues like railroad regulation. And Congress looked for national laws that would require interstate rail lines to be reasonable and just. Both the Sherman Act and the Interstate Commerce Act were haphazardly enforced and narrowly interpreted by the courts, though, and they had little practical effect. So the federal government is just beginning to try to deal with these big, vertically integrated businesses that are dominating the country, buying up all the competition and driving up prices on ordinary Americans. Imagine, I'm trying to think of an example comparable to the rail lines. Imagine if a business owned a section of road that cut across town and you had to pay to use that system of road, and it was the only road to the place you wanted or needed to be. You would pay, and they would charge whatever they'd want to charge because no one else could do it. So if a rail line cuts is relatively near your farm and it goes exactly where you need it to go, or at least close enough, it's the only game in town, and you'd have to drag your crops 80 miles south to hit another rail line. You're going to pay whatever you've got to pay to move your crops. And so Congress is beginning to recognize that this is an issue, that these big, huge businesses are abusing their power. But even though they're passing laws, they don't have the means and they don't have the offices and resources. The federal government doesn't. It's not big enough yet to really do anything about it. So laws get passed but then get disregarded. No group watched the performance of the federal government at the end of the 19th century with greater frustration than American farmers. They turned their anger into action by organizing a political movement to reshape the nation's laws. Farmers have been organizing to teach each other scientific methods of raising crops, of digging ditches, of moving water, of raising animals. They've been doing that for a long time. But economic hardships and federal inaction turned their organizations pretty darn political in the 1870s and 1880s. These farmers' organizations in the North, out West, down South, they successfully challenged local and state laws beginning in the 1870s, but knew they would need to take the reforms to the national level to seriously challenge the effect big business was having on their small businesses, their farms. In places like Florida and Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Omaha, Nebraska, farmers met to proclaim the creation of a new political party in America to prove a set of common principles that they'd abide by. They met to nominate a candidate for the presidency. They called themselves populists, and they were members of the People's Party. They tried to incorporate other people into their organization, too. They tried to attract labor, specifically, the people working in the cities. But the movement always remained largely agrarian or rural. That's where it had its roots, and they couldn't attract groups like the Knights of Labor or the AFL. They had trouble doing so because they had different visions of what America should look like, even though they agreed on some things. And disagreement about incorporating blacks into the party further prevented the party from challenging the Democrats and Republicans in any serious or permanent way. Ideologically, populists called for a graduated income tax, and that is the rich would pay not only more in tax, but a higher rate than other people. They called for the abolition of national banks. They were deeply suspicious of these big banks that would loan big companies money. They wanted to end absentee ownership of land. So if you weren't working on land or plowing it or making it productive, they thought you shouldn't be able to own that land. They wanted the direct election of senators, which we get eventually in the early 20th century, and which we're used to. We vote for senators today. They wanted government-owned warehouses where they could store their crops in times of surplus or low prices. Most importantly, they rejected the laissez-faire orthodoxies of their time. That means the leave-it-alone way that government approached life in the United States. The leave-it-alone way of the leave-it-alone attitude toward business, I guess. And these people, these populists, raised the most powerful challenge to industrial capitalism America had ever known and probably has ever known. The Panic of 1893 launched the most severe depression the nation had ever seen. It started with the failure of two railroads, the Philadelphia and the Reading Railroad, which is in the game Monopoly. It started with those railroads' failure to make payments on loans they'd taken out. 2 months later, other businesses were failing, and a stock market collapse sunk many of the national banks, which caused a contraction in the market. A lot less money was available to be borrowed, forcing many small loan-dependent businesses to in turn fail. This is like dominoes stacked up. Once a few go down, they take a whole lot with them. The Depression reflected the degree to which all parts of the American economy were now connected. It also showed how dependent Americans had become on the biggest railroad, corporate, and financial institutions of the nation. 20% of workers lost their jobs in the Depression. In efforts to organize marches of the unemployed on Washington and calls for a public works program to put some of these people back to work, those went ignored by Congress. To many Americans, the fallout from the Depression, the Homestead and Pullman strikes, for example, they were a sign that dangerous instability and maybe even revolution was afoot. Labor radicalism, real and exaggerated, heightened a sense of crisis at the end of the 19th century. So ordinary people who have a lot in common with these other people who've lost their jobs, other people who are marching in the streets, other people who are raising up and taking arms against their employers, most ordinary people are terrified and are unwilling to make that leap and jump in and say, yeah, something needs to change in America. They were content to keep their job and just keep eking out a living. Financially, the money question became a major issue in American politics after the Depression. The debate centered on what would be the basis for the American dollar and what would give it value. Today, the American dollar rests on little more than public confidence in the government to pay its own debts. So when I pay you $1 for a service, the dollar only has value because we both believe it has value, and we believe it has 1/5 the value of a $5 bill and 1/20 the value of a $20 bill. So we all just generally agree and give meaning to these dollar bills. They used to have currency backing them up. Ever since the 1960s, early 70s, nothing backs up our dollar but confidence in the government and the scarcity of the dollars themselves. The fact that only so many are printed give them value too, or we assign value because of scarcity. We'll talk about that more in class. Officially, the government was supposed to back it up with gold and silver in a ratio of 1 to 16. So if the government had 16 pieces of silver and 1 piece of gold, that had $2. And in vaults, we had all this gold and silver. Even in places like Fort Knox, we still have some gold. But we used to have as much, we would only print as much money on paper as gold and silver that we had. But Congress ditched silver in 1873, and few people noticed at the time. They only started backing up money with gold. As silver prices plummeted and money dried up after the Depression, after people stopped lending and the price of silver went way down, farmers suspected a conspiracy between big banks and Congress to devalue currency and to essentially lower the prices of crops. And they demanded government action. This is their first big issue. And a lot of people get really worked up about it because the government was supposed to be doing something from its origin. From the very beginning, they'd agreed this 1:16 ratio is what they're going to do. It's going to be gold and silver. When they got rid of it, it was too close to the Depression, and everyone was looking for a way to blame the government for the Depression, and this is a way to do it. The Democratic Party, long blamed for the economic depression, fell to pieces in 1896. Ultimately, the Democrats nominated the free silver firebrand candidate William Jennings Bryan as their party candidate for the 1896 presidential election. He was this guy who was along with the populists and represented a lot of what they had to say. He unexpectedly started speaking at the convention and gave this speech. And even though the Democrats have been blamed for the economic depression, the Democrats say, okay, well, let's join forces with these populist ideas. Let's incorporate what these farmers want to do so that we have a shot at winning the next election. We've been beaten up pretty badly for quite some time based on or from this depression. If we want a shot of winning, we got to change. So William Jennings Bryan gives this Cross of Gold speech. It rallied the anti-business movement in America, and it pulled populists into the Democratic Party. It scared the wits out of the Republicans because he was essentially calling for an economic sort of a brand new kind of revolution in America. Bryan stumped all across the country and spoke to some 5 million Americans as he went across the country making his case. And it's called the Cross of Gold speech because he essentially says that it's the rich versus the poor in America. It's the Republicans, the rich, versus the poor, the Democrats, and all the changes he's implementing or wants to implement are for the benefit of those most affected by the Depression. So it's a very anti-elite, anti-wealth message he's taking across the country. He lost, though. His message was pretty narrow. He lost the election, and the People's Party began to dissolve. Although Bryan's impact on American politics was far from over, we'll talk more about William Jennings Bryan later on. After the acrimonious social protests of the 19th century, American attention shifted overseas with a new manifest destiny gripping the nation as the economy improved after Republicans won that election in 1896. It was McKinley. The economy starts to get better. People forget about all those money issues. This new manifest destiny was a product of a handful of developments. First, the experience of subjugating Indian tribes that established a precedent for exerting colonial control over dependent people. That's a mouthful. What that means is we could go. So what we're about to talk about is imperialism, and that is the idea of going overseas, kind of taking some land for our own, kind of colonizing it, making it our own, exporting goods, exerting influence over a totally different part of the world, kind of extracting its wealth, but then putting it to work too. So the experience of dealing with Indians effectively and finally kind of dealing with Indians, putting them on reservations and controlling them, means we can probably deal with any group on the planet. We can take a navy somewhere, kind of take over a part of a country and effectively deal with it. We know we can do that now after we've subjugated the Native Americans. The closing of the frontier, which in 1893, a paper was published that essentially said what made America great was the frontier, this act of moving west. Now, moving west is over because there's no more west, and so what are we going to become? So people were concerned about this. The closing of the frontier produced the fears that natural resources would soon dwindle, which means we start to look overseas for new opportunities. That old depression from the 1890s convinced businessmen to look abroad for new economic opportunities. And above all else, these are all reasons why we start to look abroad. Americans were noticing the imperial efforts of European powers to secure foreign lands for their own benefit. And even ordinary Americans worried they would be missing out on the best markets, the best colonies, and the best strategic places or spaces for military bases. For all these reasons, we'll go over them in class too. We begin to look abroad and say, why don't we, instead of fighting amongst ourselves, why don't we look abroad and try to make a better country by taking some more land from other people, other places. Scholars and imperialists justified their expansionism by pointing to Darwin's theories. They contended that nations or races, just like species, struggled for existence and only the fittest would survive. For strong nations to dominate weak ones, then, was in accordance with the laws of nature. America looked abroad to build markets, colonies, and naval bases in the beginning of the 20th century. In Hawaii, Americans built a presence to support a greater trade with the Chinese. As early as 1810, Americans had brought Christianity, infectious diseases, liquor, firearms, and capitalism to the Polynesian people of the Hawaiian Islands. They bought land, planted sugar, and imported people from other nations to work in those sugarcane fields, which displaced Hawaiians and forever altered the rhythm of daily life on those Hawaiian islands. Native Hawaiians did not accept their subjugation without protest, and only with its formal recognition and eventual statehood did the people of Hawaii accept their new American destiny. There's a whole story there. There's a princess who refused to be a pawn of the American government and almost set up a bloody revolution in the country, but we gave them enough and eventually made them American citizens and then made them a state. So now they're one of us. After he defeated the populist hero William Jennings Bryan, the conservative Republican William McKinley used his political capital to drum up conflict with Spain in support of Cuban independence just south of our state of Florida. McKinley protested Spain's uncivilized and inhuman conduct in their battle for Cuba, but it was the destruction of the American battleship Maine off of Cuba that pushed Americans off the sidelines and onto the field. Americans believed the Spanish had blown up this ship, and Congress immediately authorized war with Spain. What's funny, though, is that experts generally agree, even a few years afterwards, experts began to believe that the ship exploded due to an engine issue and that the Spanish had not blown it up at all. So the reason we got into this war was fraudulent. The Secretary of State John Hay called the Spanish-American conflict a splendid little war. It's a name which stuck because American soldiers were essentially on mop-up duty in this conflict. 5,200 American soldiers died from disease, but fewer than 500 died from actual battle wounds. Many American soldiers who were sent back or who were sent to the war were not our top forces. Many regiments were black soldiers, and both blacks and whites fought alongside black Cuban soldiers in Cuba. The experience gave African Americans in the military a much stronger sense of injustice that they carried back to the South upon their return. American imperialists converted American support for Cuba into an occasion for acquiring overseas possessions, i.e. former Spanish colonies like Cuba, and other places like the Philippines. By an accident of history, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Cuban Revolution was Theodore Roosevelt, who would soon be president. He was the one who sent American naval ships to attack the Spanish in the Philippines, which opened the door to expansion into other Spanish colonies. After we beat the Spanish, we started to take all their colonies up. Under armistice, after the fighting, Spain recognized the independence of Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, gave us those colonies, and accepted American occupation of Manila in the Philippines. Puerto Ricans had fought for decades for rights and independence under Spanish rule. Americans quickly converted the island into an economic colony, displacing workers, awarding them titular citizenship, calling them American citizens, and transforming the island into a sugar and other cash crop haven for American businesses. We're seeing a model, the same model that we saw in Hawaii. Americans get claim to a land, they come in for seemingly good reasons and extract what they can from it, make it very productive. It is a product of capitalism. There are certainly two perspectives on what we did in these places, though. The reality is now that these people are American citizens, and in the case of Hawaii, they have their own state. Puerto Rico has the right to become a state if it wants to, if the American people will let it, which we could see in our lifetime. The annexation of the Philippines was the first test case for a multifaceted American anti-imperialist movement in America. Not everyone in the United States thinks it's a good idea that we're going other places, bringing our way of life to these people, and then changing the island to extract wealth and to set up businesses there that can make money. To many, including Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain, controlling a large and densely populated territory thousands of miles away seemed very different and more ominous than our earlier imperial efforts. The Philippines are much farther away than Hawaii and especially Cuba and Guam. Some opposed imperialism on moral grounds. It's the wrong thing to do, to move into a land, to take land from people, and to kind of push ourselves onto the land and say, well, it's kind of ours now. Others feared polluting the American population by incorporating Asians into it. Some were terrified that these Asians could call themselves Americans now. We were a white nation at the time. Conservatives worried that long-standing armies, the constant use of armies and building up armies will only lead to greater international entanglements. We'd always be involved abroad. And some laborers feared an influx of cheap labor from overseas. So every people of every political stripe opposed this. It wasn't just a certain sort of person that was in favor of imperialism, and those who opposed it, very different reasons, some good and some not so good. However, after ruling out other options, President McKinley sought to uplift the native population, a boon to business interests and pro-imperial forces in America who believed such efforts invigorated the nation's spirit. Honestly, McKinley wasn't too enthusiastic about it either. But once we were in the Philippines, he didn't know what to do. He didn't think we could just leave them because the Spanish had been ruling them. He thought if we left, they would collapse. And so he thought that if we brought business, capitalism, and Christianity, we would make the place better. So the imperialists won the day, and the Republicans benefited from it. McKinley was reelected in 1900 with the hero of the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt, as his vice president. Where Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico represented relatively few problems, the Philippines were a foreign policy quagmire. The conflict in the Philippines is the least remembered of all American wars. It lasted 4 years and involved 200,000 American troops, more than we ever sent at any one time into Iraq or Afghanistan. At least 50,000 Filipinos died in the conflict. American occupiers faced brutal guerrilla tactics there and found themselves acting much like the Spanish had in Cuba, which is kind of why we went to Cuba, because the Cubans were fighting the Spanish. The Spanish were acting in pretty brutal ways to try to keep power over Cuba. But we start to act a lot like the Spanish in the Philippines. Captured Filipino guerrillas were not treated as prisoners of war, but they were often simply shot after being captured. Americans put entire native populations into concentration camps. Soldiers came to view, not all of them, but many soldiers came to view Filipinos as almost subhuman, as almost like a different species. And some American soldiers took pleasure in arbitrarily killing them, even innocent people. By 1902, reports of American atrocities had soured the American public on the war. By then, though, the war had run its course and Filipinos gradually secured their independence from us formally in 1946. We have no more claim to the Philippines. That conflict opened doors into nearby China, which during this era was already being carved up by the English, the French, German, Russian, and Japanese powers. Secretary of State John Hay suggested an open-door policy with the nations that claim parts of China, a policy that would allow free trade between colonial powers claiming Chinese territories. This is interesting. This is the early 20th century. Our Secretary of State is calling for a free trade, like a national an international policy of free trade with all these countries. It took a bizarre Chinese revolt called the Boxer Rebellion to convince the other nations that said that we own these parts of China now to accept Hay's request, which allowed China to maintain its territorial integrity and kept trade alive between America and China during this era. This is interesting. This is the beginning, I guess, of international free trade. But it took this small Chinese revolution called the Boxer Rebellion, where these mystics, almost like monk-like people, beat up all these Germans, Russians, Japanese, not all of them, but they launched these small little revolutions all across the country, which allowed all these other imperial powers to back off and essentially kept China the way it was. So China only really exists because of this. Still exists. The Spanish-American War revealed glaring deficiency in the American military system. After the war, McKinley appointed a Secretary of War to supervise a major overhaul of the armed forces. The regular army went from 25,000 troops to 100,000 troops, even in times of peace. Officer training schools were instituted, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were established to act as military advisors to the Secretary of War. As a result, the United States entered the 20th century with something resembling a modern military system. So we're becoming a much more modern nation as we enter the 20th century. The federal government is still very, very weak, but it is trying different things, and people are trying to make it more powerful. Farmers want it more powerful to deal with big business. Imperialists want it more powerful to lay claim to other parts of the world, to make us bigger and stronger. And in some ways, we today expect the federal government to be incredibly powerful. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, Louisiana, what was it that Kanye West said? George Bush doesn't care about black people. We expect the federal government, when something bad happens, to step in and save us and fix problems that arise. It took us a long time to get there, and it's early in the 20th century that we begin for the first time to ask and expect the federal government that are affecting our nation.